know our now past president from just a few days ago, Professor John Challis. John graduated from the University of Loughborough in 1991 and has spent most of his research career at the Penn State University. And I'm sure many of us have actually referenced many of John's fantastic papers around modelling, simulation, musculoskeletal biomechanics. And of course, most of these kind of presentations, people talk about everyone's research track records as how many citations they have, how many publications, etc. But I thought I'd skip that for John. And I went onto the web, as you do, and Googled a little bit, and I found this fantastic site where students get a chance to talk about their lecturers. And there was quite a few posts there, blogs for Professor John Challis. I'm just going to read a few of them out, so excuse me for reading. First one is, epic. One of the coolest professors I've ever had at Penn State. Lectures are laid back, plenty of good stories mixed to help explain the material. I learned a lot from his class. Dr. Challis is a great person and professor. He's a pretty good sense of humour, makes lectures easy to listen to, so definitely go to his classes. Try to get to know him because he's extremely helpful and wants the students to ask questions. Dr. Challis is great. He clearly enjoys what he does, very helpful if you have trouble understanding concepts, and an all-around pleasant person to be around. Great teacher, but you need to follow him and keep reading his stuff to get a good grade. This is one I like here. Helpful guy, has a great teaching style, keeps you awake with humour, though most jokes are not that funny. Overall, a good teacher and a great human being. I think that says everything about John Challis, and in the same vein, John has been a great supporter of ISB, the Society, and has driven really many very important initiatives in that same style. Over the 4 years as President-elect and past President, he's been a strong supporter of societies, their EDC initiatives, student awards, travel grants, and has been engaged with the Glasgow organisers all the way through to this particular bid and event. I look forward personally to working with John over the coming years, and I'm particularly looking forward to listening to the President's lecture. Professor John Challis.
Well, that was a very nice introduction. Thank you very much. So, when I stood to be president, I was thinking all the things that I could do administratively, and I didn't realize at that point that it came with the responsibility to deliver the President's lecture. And when I looked at the schedule, I realized the President's lecture just delays you getting to the party by 30 minutes. So it is a tradition, but I'm sorry that I'm delaying your celebrations. The keynotes at this conference have been given the sort of brief to try and review some of the past, some of the present, and look to the future. So I'm going to try and do the same within my lecture. But I'm going to start off by outlining my inspirations. Then I'm going to talk briefly about motion measurement, past, present, and future perspectives, muscle mechanics, past, present, future perspectives, and then rigid body analyses. So these are the 18 presidents that preceded me. And they're a real tough act to follow. And each one of them has pushed the society ahead. Each one of them has done some important things for the society, but also some important research. So this is a tough act to follow. When I realized I had to give the President's lecture, I cast my mind back and I thought, well, I remember when Walter gave his lecture, and he gave us some really interesting insights to muscle mechanics and gave a great lecture. I thought, well, that's a tough act to follow, but not everybody's interested in muscle, so maybe I shouldn't worry about his too much. And then the next one that I saw was Julie Steele's. And Julie Steele did a lot about breast biomechanics with lots of really interesting videos that grabbed everybody's attentions. I thought, well, I can't really follow that one. And then last ISB Congress, Ton van den Bogaert did, again, a really nice presentation reflecting across the whole of his career. And I thought, well, you know, I hope Ton does a great talk, but I hope he lowers the bar a little bit so that when it's my turn, it won't be too tough. But what Ton did was he started off with a joke and then another joke, and everybody laughed. So the last 2 years, I've been trying jokes out on my students, and with not much success, so I don't really have much to offer in that sense. But certainly the past presidents have been a tremendous inspiration in a multitude of ways, and I suspect there's many people in the audience that can speak to these guys as an inspiration. So I looked for two other sources of inspiration. So one is David Hilbert. So some of you may be familiar with his work, or you may be familiar with the concept of Hilbert's space. But one of the things that David Hilbert did was in 1900, he did what was effectively a keynote presentation at the International Congress of Mathematicians, which was held in Paris. And on August the 8th, he stood up and he presented 16 problems that he thought that math should endeavor to try and solve in the near future. When he wrote the full paper up, there were 23 problems. And these are some of these problems have since been solved. Some people are still actively working on. In fact, there are $1 million prizes to solve some of these problems. So that was a great agenda that he set. Now, I'm not going to set an agenda like that, but I thought that sort of idea of looking to the future and what some of our problems and challenges might be was a genuine inspiration. And I particularly like as well this quote from Hilbert where, when you're trying to phrase a problem, you want it to be difficult, but not too difficult. My next inspiration is not this river, but is the name of the river. So this is a river, and it's the Kelvin River. And coming to the Congress, we've been walking alongside the Clyde, and one of the tributaries into the Clyde River is the Kelvin River. And William Thomson, a physicist, when he was given a lordship by Queen Victoria, when you get one of those in Great Britain, then you're the lord of somewhere. And he adopted Glasgow as his home, and the Kelvin River ran past his home. And so he said, well, I'd like to be Lord Kelvin. So Lord Kelvin was a great physicist. His remains are in Westminster Abbey, just along from Isaac Newton. So that's a pretty good person to hang out with for eternity. So, what inspiration can Lord Kelvin give me? Well, so this is a famous quote from Kelvin. I often say when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. Well, I can relate to that. I think, so Lord Kelvin's that's just generally a good idea that I think people working in many domains in science, and particularly in biomechanics, could relate to. Here's another quote from Lord Kelvin. So Fourier's theorem is not only one of the most beautiful results of modern analysis, but it can be said to furnish an indispensable instrument in the treatment of nearly every recondite question in modern physics and many problems in modern biomechanics. So I think, Lord Kelvin is a genuine inspiration. But remember, the idea here is to look at the past, the present, and the future. So how was Lord Kelvin at predicting the future? So he said, heavier than air flying machines are impossible. Well, on December the 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers managed to stay in the air for 3 seconds. As the months went by, they stayed in the air for longer than longer, and they actually proved Lord Kelvin wrong. He also said that radio has no future. And he thought that this was an experimental artifact, that radio waves didn't really exist, and he certainly didn't think it was going to change the face of what we do. But Helmholtz, in the autumn of 1886, managed to show that radio waves do exist. And now, if you're driving along in your car, you listen to the radio, but you may even have a telemetry system for your EMG that transmits a radio signal. So radio signals are definitely with us. And then another one of Lord Kelvin's pronouncements was that X-rays will prove to be a hoax. Well, the picture you see there is an experimental setup from Wilhelm Röntgen's lab, where he actually showed that X-rays do genuinely exist. So I'm using Lord Kelvin as an inspiration because a lot of his predictions were entirely wrong. So if my predictions are wrong, then that's okay. I'm just the same as Lord Kelvin. So the idea is I'm going to sort of peer into a crystal ball and try and make not predictions about things that will happen, but predictions about things that we should be exploring and that might actually happen. So remember, the past, present, and the future. So I'm going to talk about motion measurement first, then a little bit about muscle mechanics, and then a little bit about rigid body analyses. Now, obviously I've been pretty busy at this Congress, but as I've been ducking in and out of sessions and going to as many of the keynotes as I can, a lot of people put up Muybridge images and Mare images, and then they talk about Mare and Muybridge, and I'm going to do the same. And at the start of the week, I thought perhaps I wouldn't because so many people had used them. Then I thought, well, no, if it's that popular, then I should just follow the herd and do it. But I'd also like to highlight these pictures to you. So these are cave paintings that are over 17,000 years old. Now, we don't know why they were painted. They could have been painted for artistic reasons, but they could have been painted for, in some way, trying to catalog aspects of movement. But if we look at the deer on the left-hand side, we can see that The deer are running and they're in various different poses. And to some extent, the artist, whoever it was 17,000 years ago in France, captured some of the essential aspects of a deer running along. And by the same token, on the right-hand side, we've got people loading bows for firing arrows and pulling on bows and firing arrows. So this is certainly an early cataloguing of human and animal motion. Of course, we fast forward many, many years, and then we get to the work of Étienne-Jules Marey. And people have spoken about Marey. I think I've counted at least 3 talks that I've been to where people have talked about Marey's work. And I'd like just to do a sort of different juxtaposition and say that Marey's work was to try and understand a lot about human movement. In fact, he studied animal movement to try and understand more about human movement. And why did the French government fund him to do this? Because the French had lost some very important, and if you're British, you know which these are, lost some very important battles at the start of the 1800s. And they decided that if they could fund someone that could understand more about human movement, that they may be able to create better and more efficient soldiers. So the funding for his work, which we now consider seminal, was really based around sort of militaristic needs. And again, I've seen these images before at this Congress, but this is a typical image that Marey produced. And it's also the type of image, if you walked around the exhibition space, you saw a lot of the vendors showing their wares and demonstrating these types of images. So then we moved to the Englishman that moved to America, Edward Muybridge. And Muybridge settled in San Francisco. And he started off as a bookseller who then became a portrait photographer. So this is a self-portrait. But Muybridge was many other things as well. So he actually was a very successful landscape photographer. So those of you familiar with some of the works of Ansel Adams, the photos that Ansel Adams took of Yosemite are very, very similar and often taken from the same type of spots that many years earlier that Muybridge had used for taking photos. He was also a fabulous showman. So reports of when he toured around the world showing sequences of images talk about how he sort of wound the audience up and then revealed these images. Now, the type of work that he did is pretty easy for us to replicate these days, but even so, he was a tremendous showman, and his work was the front page of the newspapers, and his presentation was absolutely fabulous. He was also tried for murder, so he admitted that he shot somebody, but he claimed it was justifiable homicide. He was also a little bit crazy. He also had a brain injury because he was injured in a wagon train accident. And he was also an acquaintance of the governor of California. So not this guy, but this guy. So this guy is Leland Stanford. Leland Stanford, when he died, left his farm, and Stanford University lives on that site. But Stanford was was the governor for a while of California, was one of the wealthiest men in America, and he made his money predominantly out of railroads. And he had a bet with one of his fellow railway owners that when a horse trots, that it has all 4 hoofs off the ground at the same time. And the guy that he bet with never thought that Leland Stanford would be in a position to show that whether one of them was correct or not. But Stanford knew Muybridge and said to Muybridge, "What will it take?" And Muybridge said, "Well, it's going to take a lot of work." So he employed Muybridge for a large number of years. And Muybridge had to do a whole bunch of things. He had to develop a shutter that would open and close very quickly, because prior to that, they just used to take the lens cap off the camera and expose the portrait or the landscape for 10 seconds and then put the cap back on again. So he had to develop a very fast shutter. He had to develop a chemical emulsion that could react really quickly when it was only getting exposure to light for maybe 1/24 of a second. So these were significant technical developments. This is a shot from the experimental setup at Stanford's farm, and what you have is a series of cameras along one side and a bunch of trip switches from those cameras, so that as a horse passes along, it hits a trip switch and the shutter opens and closes, and then effectively from each of the cameras, you put that together, you get a sequence. And eventually, after 4 years of hard work, Muybridge managed to get a shot of the horse Occidental, which is a famous horse at the time, with all 4 hoofs off the ground when it was trotting. And you could buy this is not Occidental, but you could buy postcards of this type, and they say this was considered as if the world had been turned upside down. These were fabulous insights that had just been captured from movement. And after a world tour, Muybridge returned to the States, but actually went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where he catalogued human and animal movement, spent hour upon hour and week upon week, year upon year, cataloguing many aspects of human movement. And we've seen many of his images, because a lot of times when you guys have been making presentations, you found one of Muybridge's images where he's collected images of the tasks that you're analyzing. So this is a particular image that Phil Rowe asked me to show, because there will be dancing at the party tonight. Clothes are compulsory, I'm told. These guys were also funded by a military effort. So the Mare, a military effort, Muybridge funded and started as a work initiated by a gambling or a bet, and these guys wanted to make the German soldiers more efficient. And in some ways, these are forebears of modern biomechanics, because you've got one guy with a great knowledge of anatomy and another guy with a great knowledge of mathematics. And so they actually took measurements. Mare and Muybridge really didn't take measurements. So they took a series of exposed series of film multiple times to get images, and this is one of their subjects literally wired up. And then they got a photographic plate with the images on, and then they would recourse to this device. And effectively, you're looking down the eyepiece, and then you line the eyepiece up so that it's aligned with the landmark you're interested in, and then you can read off of a vernier scale, 2 vernier scales, the location on the image of that particular coordinate. Then you start cranking the thing again to move the eyepiece so that it can see the next landmark, and then it can see the next landmark, and so on. It took them 7 years to analyze 3 subjects walking under a limited number of conditions. This is the type of stuff that if we went into the lab now, we could complete in less than a morning's work, but this was 7 years of hard work. If you get a chance to talk to one of the older people here, not that much older, and if they did motion analysis for their PhD, probably prior to 1990, maybe a little bit earlier than that, they probably used a camera like the one on the right, and then spent 6 months in a darkened room digitizing their data, so projecting the film, and this is a Vanguard analyzer, and actually measuring the coordinates of it. So again, to get data on 8 subjects could have been 5 mornings a week for 6 months of just data analysis. But now we've got these high-speed systems. So they automatically track markers for us. We can place the markers in lots of locations. We can put the cameras to surround them. The subject can walk along, and we can capture data pretty readily and pretty quickly. We've got a number of options as to how we place the markers. We can place the markers on the skin. We can place them in clusters. And then we get images such as this. So where we're actually getting at somewhat at what the underlying bones are doing. But the problem is that those markers in those previous 2 shots are sort of sitting on top of the skin. So if you're brave or crazy, then you do this to your own foot and you screw cortical pins in so you can actually track the bones directly. But this is great data, but it's highly invasive, and you just wonder whether under those conditions, when the instruction is to walk or run normally, how normally or the subjects actually walk and run. But clearly, this type of technique gives us the very best possible data. So when I look into my crystal ball for what the future might hold for motion analysis, well, I don't really know, but obviously we've got significant developments with these inertial measurement units, so maybe further developments there. Maybe we'll have really good markerless systems. So there are markerless systems available, but maybe we'll have systems that really give accuracy from a markerless system that's comparable to our marker-based system. Maybe that's even comparable to a marker-based system that's using cortical pins. Maybe we can make subjects, imagine in a clinical setting that you're looking at somebody's gait and they just walk down the corridor to go to the doctor's office, and while they're walking down the corridor, some suitably placed sensors will actually make measurements so we can measure them fully clothed. And then also, we started the week with the Wartenweiler lecture, where Professor Capozzo was talking about correcting from soft tissue artifact. Well, clearly, we need to really, if we want to understand what's happening to the bones, we really need to try and work out how to correct for that soft tissue artifact. But I have an asterisk beside that because I'm going to come back to the soft tissue artifact in a little while. So this is an image of Fred Astaire jumping for joy. So if we could solve all those problems, we would be jumping for joy, particularly if the associated hardware and software was very cheap. But the other point here is that it would be great if, when someone was jumping for joy like this, we had sensors that would allow us to work out what both his soft tissue and what his skeletal structure was doing, even though he's wearing clothes. And of course, there have been some developments in markerless tracking of motion, but when we look to the future, and it's difficult to predict, but who's to say in 5, 10, 15 years' time what type of technology might be available to really let us get to grips with measuring the motion we're interested in. Okay, so muscle mechanics. I really like the work of Nicholas Steno. So when I first saw some of his images, and I was skimming through an issue of Journal of Biomechanics, and someone done a review of his work, and when I looked at the images, I didn't realize they dated back to the 17th century. I actually thought it was modern work. It was only when I started to read the paper that I realized this came from the work of Nicholas Steno. Now, interestingly, Pope John III, I think if I remember correctly, actually beatified Nicholas Steno. So he's actually one step removed from being a saint. So I cited a lord earlier on. I'm citing that someone that's virtually a saint here. So I'm really trying to deal with people working on a very high level. This is a sketch that Steno made of a sort of structure of muscle, with a muscle crossing the joint, having strips of tendon at either end of the muscle belly, but also importantly the muscles being pennated. Here's another sketch that he made, so where we've got two layers of a ponerotic tendon, and then in between those we have muscle fibers that are pennated with reference to the line of action of the tendon. One of the important things of this conceptualization of muscle is that Steno is assuming that all the muscle fibers that are within the muscle are all of the same length. And so in modern analyses, we often have models that are schematically like this, with a little bit of tendon at either end where they're pennated, and then we have a contractile element in the middle that has certain key properties. So when we look at the work of Andrew Huxley, so Andrew Huxley's most famous achievement was that he was a Wharton-Wilder lecturer. He also won a Nobel Prize, but I think the Wharton-Wilder lecture says more about you than a Nobel Prize does. But in 1966, using some very sophisticated methodology, he was able to track the length of a sarcomere and simultaneously measure the force that it produced. So we get the force length properties of muscle. Another Nobel Prize winner is A.V. Hill, and A.V. Hill in 1938 managed to measure how, as the force that a muscle produces, as the velocity that a muscle shortens at, the force that it can produce, or how that force changes. So we get the force velocity properties of muscle. And the work of Huxley and Hill are implicit and often explicit within many people's muscle models. So I'm going to just briefly step through a number of studies that we've done looking at one particular muscle. Now, my guesstimate is that what my research group believe that we know about the first dorsal interosseous is probably true for other muscles, but I'll give it the caveat that we've only examined in detail the first dorsal interosseous, and it's a tiny muscle that allows you to do that. So we dissected a large number of first dorsal interossi out of cadavers. We then bathe them in nitric acid, and then that dissolves away the connective tissue. When you dissolve away the connective tissue, you can actually tease out the fascicles and measure the fascicle lengths. So this is a representative muscle, so from one cadaver. And what we're plotting here is showing that all the fascicles are not the same length. And remember that fascicles are just bundles of fibers, that there's almost like normal distribution. So we've got some very short fascicles, and we have some very long fascicles. And the picture at the top there shows you some representative images of some fascicles we dissected out. But what does that mean? Well, oftentimes when we say we're modeling fibers, we're really modeling fascicles, and if we assume all the fibers are the same length and we're really modeling the fascicle, then we're assuming the fascicles are the same length, which is clearly not the case for this muscle. But what about the fibers? Well, we did the same thing. So you can tease fibers out from the fascicles and then image them, and then if you image them, you can count the number of sarcomeres that comprise the muscle, and then when you count the number of sarcomeres, you can work out what the optimum length of all the fibers are. So we did this for multiple fibers comprising many cadaver first dorsal interossi. But just to illustrate a representative cadaver, in this particular cadaver, we had fibers with optimal lengths as short as 3.8 millimeters, but as long as nearly 9 millimeters. So clearly, when we're thinking about modeling muscle and we assume that all the muscle fibers are all the same length so that we can model them very conveniently using Huxley's relationship and Hill's relationship, certainly for the first dorsal interosseous, that's not true. So this is just to remind you of our sort of conceptualization. And the general idea is that this bit is the same length for all the fibers, or that we can find a characteristic length that represents all the fibers. But with the range that we've seen, that's probably unlikely. So if you've got a really expensive toy on campus, it's your obligation to play with it. So this is a 14.1 Tesla magnet that we have at Penn State. So we took some cadaver FDIs and put it in the magnet, and we had a specially designed coil. And by processing that data, we could actually identify the tubes of collagen within which the fascicles lie. So this gives you, this is one little particular image, but this is another image. So I've not got all those tubes of fascicles represented, but what you can see for the blue strip here is a ponerotic tendon. There's some tendon at the other end of the muscle, and there's a particular fascicle, there's a fascicle, there's a fascicle, and so on. So we can actually identify the paths of all the fascicles. What happens when we identify the paths is a whole bunch of somewhat contraindicative stuff. So, as many other people have identified, sometimes there's a fascicle that doesn't attach to the external tendon, so it doesn't attach to the tendon either end of the muscle. So this is floating in the intracellular matrix, and the force it produces is transmitted to the external tendon via that intracellular matrix. But we also have fascicles that lie in series with one another. And in our analysis, we showed about 10% of the fascicles that are within the first dorsal interosseous lie in series with one another. That means, now, that means that if those two fascicles are simultaneously activated, then they're really going to function like one super long fiber, or one super long fascicle. So that actually makes the architecture even more complicated. We can simulate what's going on, and we can simulate that by in this case, taking the force length properties of a sarcomere, saying, well, we've got some sarcomeres that are a few millimeters long, some that are up to 9 millimeters long. We've got 10% of these fascicles lying in series with one another, and then assuming there's a maximum isometric action, we can then simulate what for the whole muscle belly, what its force length curve looks like. And it looks like this. So it's got this sort of very long tail end. And that's very atypical of the type of force length relationship that people assume in most muscle models. But because of the implicit architecture, because we're still using the simple assumptions that Steno made over 400 years ago, or nearly 400 years ago, we're missing some of the subtlety that's going on. So if I think about muscle mechanics, and I'm looking into my crystal ball again, what do I think? Well, we've seen many papers at this Congress already where people are trying to personalize the parameters of a muscle model. So I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that. My personal area is to try and understand a lot more about the architecture and how that, if we have more detail to the architecture, trying to understand how the architecture dictates performance. But there's a whole bunch of other issues associated with muscle function. How does activation scale things? For example, there's some shift in the optimum length at various different levels of activation. Intramuscular and intermuscular force transmissions, stretch-induced force enhancement, the role of titin. The guy on the right lived about 300 miles south of here in a village called Ockham, so it's William of Ockham. And William of Ockham had something that we now call Ockham's razor. And Ockham's razor is often presented as the principle that you should keep things as simple as possible. And so oftentimes when we're modeling, we say, well, we're going to invoke Ockham's razor. But a razor is something that shaves things away. So a lot of times people use Ockham's razor to say, well, I've got a really simple model, and that's fine because it sort of works, and Ockham's razor says you should keep things really simple. But in actual fact, within the concept of Ockham's razor, the idea is actually you have a little bit more of a complicated model than you need, and then you shave things away from that model, and you see whether the model still gives you the accuracy. And in doing that, you're identifying what the essential aspects are of the system. So I'm all in favor of invoking Ockham's razor. I think it's just a case of doing it in an appropriate way. Oh, and the other caveat, as one of my graduate students said to me, was that we can invoke Ockham's razor to try and keep things simple, but we perhaps need to realize that sometimes God doesn't shave with Ockham's razor. So maybe when we invoke it, we're not necessarily invoking it for the right reasons. So the final little part today is rigid body analysis. So this is Giovanni Alfonso Borelli, and he turned his back on biomechanics, or his work in biomechanics, to do more religious work, which I guess we can't hold against him. But the most famous work that he published, as far as we're concerned, relates to on the motion of animals. And this was actually published after his death. And we see images such as this. If you go and read the work, and this is, I guess, is a good measure for many of the graduate students in the audience, if you go and read the work, this is an absolutely astounding piece of work. It's a famous piece of work, and it's rightfully revered. The only thing is that he got a lot of the mechanics wrong. So sometimes you can have really good ideas that actually push the area or the field of study ahead, but you can actually still make some significant mistakes. And people can forgive you for those if some of your ideas are good enough that they move the field on. So he actually made some mistakes. But what he was trying to get at was, if you've got loads, applied to the body in one way or another, what must the muscles be doing to tolerate those particular loads? When we do the type of analysis we do, when we do the rigid body analysis to allow us to calculate, let's say, resultant joint moments and joint powers and so on, we need to know the inertial properties of the body segments. Wilfred Dempster published a paper where he dissected 8 cadavers and measured the inertial properties of those cadavers, and it was a little technical report out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. But that report has been cited over 1,800 times. And so a lot of people in biomechanics use his data in some way. And what Dempster was assuming, or what those of us that have used Dempster's data is assuming, that if we estimate the mass of the forearm and the moment of inertia of the forearm using Dempster's data, that the moment of inertia of the forearm doesn't change during the motion we're looking at. If we do the same thing for the calf, we're assuming, or the thigh, that when we impact the ground during gait, that there's no soft tissue shock wave that causes these segments to vibrate that may actually change the mass distribution and therefore change the moments of inertia. Another way we can estimate these body segment inertial parameters is using these geometric solid models. And these models, once again, to some extent rely on some of this cadaver data because they use the densities as inputs. But in addition to that, they assume that the body segment shapes don't change after measurement. And then David Winter, a former Muybridge Award winner, I think in the 1980s, he really popularized and advocated for doing inverse-type dynamic analysis, calculating resultant joint moments, and doing that assuming that the body segments are rigid. If you look at this picture, and particularly if you look at the support leg, you can actually see the effects of the oscillation of a shock wave passing up this young lady's leg. If you look on the leg with the markers on, this is not a young lady, this is a young man, and you can see the shock wave there, and you can see significant soft tissue motion. The argument that I would make is that soft tissue motion is actually part of the system, is part of the forces in the system. So with one of my former graduate students, who is sitting somewhere over there, I can't see him now, Matthew Payne, we developed a simulation model of landing from a drop. So we had people land from a 40 or so centimeter drop, and then we had a rigid model, but then we had a model also that had soft tissue components sort of hanging on the outside of that rigid central component. And then we simulated drops. So just to give you a bit of a flavor, we've got 3 curves here. The 2 curves are from the experimental data of someone dropping from 40 centimeters, and the dashed line is the result of the wobbling mass model. So the wobbling mass model seemed to reconstruct the ground reaction forces very nicely. But if we use that as a partial validation, and we did other studies in this area, but if we use that as a partial validation, we can then do inverse dynamics, working out the moments at the joints, but working out the moments at the joints either assuming the segments are rigid or assuming that they have soft tissue on the outside of the central rigid skeletal component. And on the right-hand side, you see the resultant joint moments in the sagittal plane for the ankle, knee, and hip during this landing. And this is if we assume that the whole system is rigid. And then if we allow for some of the components to move, have wobbling masses, you can see that the moments are significantly different. In fact, on the whole, they're lower. So these soft tissue components seem to be able to reduce some of the loads of the joints. So they have a really important role in that particular sense. Some of you may be familiar with passive dynamic walkers. So these are sort of minimalistic models of human locomotion that, when given a tiny slope, will actually walk with no other power than that due to gravity because of the slope down the slope. We've been playing around with passive dynamic walkers, myself and Samuel Masters, one of my graduate students, and we've done something pretty simple. We've developed a number of passive dynamic walkers, and then we make the walkers walk down the slope, and then we say, well, what happens if we add a soft tissue component, just a wobbling mass? So here you can see one represented. So it's a sort of spring damper system, little mass just attached up here, a relatively small mass, but that can oscillate. What happens is when the model leg hits the ground, that oscillates out a little bit, and what happens? It dissipates some of the energy associated with the system. This is this is an animation. This is going to work. This is one of our funkier simulations, which is why I'm showing it to you. But one of the things we see with our passive dynamic walking simulations is that any measure that we choose to use of stability, the model with the wobbling masses is much more stable. So in a very parsimonious system, just adding in a soft tissue component is actually advantageous. So when I look into my crystal ball, what do I see here when I'm thinking about these soft tissue components? Well, I think they're really very important, and I think they're a real problem if you're trying to look at what the underlying bones are doing. And so they get in the way, and we can't quite get full access to the bones. But I also think that when we try and correct for that soft tissue artifact, we're actually making a little bit of a mistake. Now, I want to sort of invoke Galileo here. So I don't think Galileo was an experimentalist, spent a lot of time rolling balls down slopes and trying to work out a principle for gravity. And Isaac Newton pretty much took the reports of all of Galileo's experiments and actually managed to formulate laws from them. And so Galileo said, measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so. Well, I think for many of the advances that we seek in biomechanics, we need to make some things measurable. So the soft tissue motion is part of the mechanics of the system. When we talk about this soft tissue artifact, an artifact is something, there's a quote, but something observed in a scientific investigation or experiment that is not naturally present. Well, this soft tissue artifact is naturally present. So we're really not dealing with a soft tissue artifact. We're dealing with the motion of the soft tissue. And clearly, if we want to know what the underlying bones are doing, we need to allow for that, to correct for that, so we can work out what the bones are doing. But we also need to appreciate that we actually therefore would have knowledge about the motion of the soft tissue, and that motion of the soft tissue is actually crucial when we try and work out what the loads are at the joints during dynamic actions. Now, I wrote my presentation and then realized this perhaps doesn't work, but I've got here, soft tissue motion is not an artifact, which it's not. So why don't we refer to it as STD, which I thought stood for soft tissue deformation, but it doesn't. And then I thought, no, perhaps we could refer to it as soft tissue information. And then as I was sitting at the back listening to the award winners, when I Googled STI, that stands for sexually transmitted infection. So both of my suggestions of alternative terms are probably worse than soft tissue artifact or STA. But certainly we don't need to think of these things as artifacts. We need to think of them as part of the mechanics of the system. This is a vertical MRI. And I know there are a lot of issues with MRI if people have metal implants, and also I know with the echo waiting times there's a time resolution issues with MRI. But imagine if you had something that was MRI-like in your lab, and someone could walk along for 5 meters, and you could get very high resolution MRI-like images at a very high sample rate. In doing that, you could directly measure what the underlying skeleton was doing. You could actually look and see how the soft tissue was oscillating relative to the skeleton. And you could actually look at what the muscles were doing and how the tendon was stretching. And obviously we can't do that, and obviously we don't quite have that technology yet. But it's something that may be in our future. Now, some of Lord Kelvin's predictions that I shared with you earlier were wrong, so maybe my prediction is wrong. But I can envisage a time hopefully in not too many congresses' time, where there's some relatively cheap and easy technology that actually gives us that. And then we can start to combine the muscle mechanics with skeletal motion, with soft tissue motion, and encapsulate all that and get even more insights. If you think that's a crazy idea, I want to present you Ernest Rutherford. Ernest Rutherford was a New Zealander that worked in Canada, then worked in the United Kingdom. And when he died, they actually put his ashes, though he was cremated, but they put his ashes between the decaying skeleton of Lord Kelvin and the decaying skeleton of Sir Isaac Newton in Westminster Abbey. So he must be pretty famous. And amongst many things, Rutherford suggested what he thought the structure of the atom was. And in 1917, he actually managed to break an atom into some of its constituent parts. And this is the experimental lab setup that he had. And it doesn't look that complicated, and looks pretty straightforward. And remember that 1917 was during the period of the First World War, and so there wasn't a lot of resources available, and yet he still managed to cobble together some equipment that allowed him to be the first person to split an atom and understand something about the constituent parts. If we fast forward not too far, then we get to the Large Hadron Collider that's in CERN. And this is a beast of piece of equipment. It's nearly 27 kilometers in circumference. It's got a lot of liquid helium-cooled magnets that accelerate particles around, and you accelerate one particle from one end, one particle from the other end, and they meet in the middle. And as they crash into one another, they destroy one another, and bits fly off. And you try and measure, what the component parts of that fly off, and from that, we now have a much more detailed understanding of what the subatomic particles are that comprise the elements of the building blocks that make the nucleus. I don't think that Rutherford could have foreseen that. I think he could have hoped for it, but he couldn't have foreseen it. If we take the same type of perspective on biomechanics, there's probably something in our future that will be similarly radical, that's going to give us tremendous insights into human movement one way or another. So this is a quote here from Winston Churchill suggesting that we don't look too far into the future. And he's also holding two fingers up. And it's two things. One is that keep working hard on biomechanics. Well, two things I'm saying you should remember. So the first one is to keep working hard on biomechanics and push us to the future and those future insights. And the second one is that if you're a member of the ISB, remain so. And if you're not a member, please join. So those are the two important things to remember. Okay, thank you all very much for your attention.